My name is Jamie Russell. I'm the director of the Appalachian Energy Center. I was interim director last year, and I've become the director as of July, so I'm still fairly new at the job. Really excited to be here. The Appalachian Energy Center is one of 3 university-affiliated university energy centers in North Carolina. And so I know we have Steve Callan, who directs the one at North Carolina State. He's going to talk more about what we do. But basically, our mission is to leverage the minds of students and their passion and creativity, and the research of professors, and deliver outreach, deliver education, and deliver research in the clean energy space to benefit the people of North Carolina. So that's in a nutshell what we do. So enough about me. I'm very privileged. I have the great honor of introducing Sushma Masemore. Sushma is our Deputy Assistant Director for Environment and State Energy Director in North Carolina, and we're very pleased to have her here again. She was introduced last night, so I'll be brief. I know we're running a little bit late. Sushma is a chemical engineer, and she has a professional engineering licensure in the state of North Carolina. And I think what's really impressive is she's spent almost the last 30 years working to improve our environment in both the public and private sectors. And of course, now she's in the public sector, and she's currently leading the implementation of Governor Cooper's Executive Order 80 efforts on climate change and the clean energy economy. So please join me in welcoming Sushma to give us a talk. Thank you.
How's everyone doing? All right, hang in there, okay? My talks are never entertaining, but they're very informative. So I'm not good for jokes or dancing. So one of the things I wanted to lay out before I even get into this topic, because it's very specific to the energy sector, is just putting in terms of what we heard today. We heard about what we want and where we want to go. But oftentimes we need to see where we've been and what's really happening outside of our minds and our world. And this really surprised me when I looked at some of the data just about a month ago. I'm sure you all are aware of the Annual Energy Outlook, which is a forecast that the Energy Information Administration issues almost every year. And the AEO 2019 forecast came out a couple months ago. And one of the stark, sobering information that was in there was the amount of oil and gas produced in our country. While we are replacing a lot of our generation with renewables because they're cheaper and they're convenient, both in the wind and the solar sector, June was the month in which renewables surpassed coal generation, the megawatt hours produced in our country for the first time. But at the same time, AEO forecast said that by the end of this year, we will have produced more oil and gas than we have since the 1950s. And then by 2020, we will be a net exporter of oil and gas. We will be producing more oil and gas than we have ever, and we'll be producing to a level that we are going to be exporting across the country to other parts of the world. So that's an inventory of fossil fuel that we all need to be aware of. And part of that is through what we talked about. That's our reality currently. So as we consider the future of cleaner energy sources, but cleaner environment, we also have to think about that there are forces in motion that we just heard about from Mr. Orr that will have to live in this world, and will have to come to a resiliency and balancing that life that we have as well as our children. So my talk is about building a resilient energy sector. We talked a lot about mitigating greenhouse gases and using market-based as well as regulatory policy approaches for innovation and development and deployment. But today I'm going to talk about resilient energy future. And what I'm going to cover is a little bit about reliability and resiliency. I'm going to, only for the sake of today, just focus on the energy sector, not the physical and cyber threats that we heard about yesterday, but more of weather-related and natural events that affect the resiliency of the grid. I'll go through a history of 2018 natural disasters. And I did not plan on doing that, but I think this is just a crowd that just likes to be depressed. So I think I am going to show you all the pictures of 2018 in motion. But then I'm going to talk a little bit about, at the state level, the kind of things we do in disaster preparedness, but resiliency planning. Let's go over a few projects that we are working with university partners, as well as the kind of things that we're envisioning moving forward. So oftentimes, we say, what is reliability? Well, our grid is reliable. When I turn on the switch, the lights come on. And that's true. Our 100-year-old system is providing reliable electricity when we want them at an affordable rate. And I'll show you why it's affordable. But it's really defined as the percent of time that the grid is available and functional when you need it. And there are a variety of metrics. I'm not an expert, but I understand just enough to see how reliability is quantified and assessed from one utility to another and from one sector to another. And some of the more common metrics is called SAIDI, SAIFI, and MED. SAIDI is System Average Interruption Duration Index. In short, this is basically the duration of the outage. SAIFI is the number of outages in a given time period. And MED, Major Event Day, occurs when SAIDI exceeds like a threshold, like the number of events in a given day. And it really is a measure of outages for a longer end of the spectrum. So as a state, the chart at the bottom shows in 2016, most of our disturbances or outages were related to weather-related events in 67%, or 2/3 of our outages were related to natural disasters. And as far as, how often is the outages in 2016? This is the latest year that the data was published. I haven't had a chance to pull 2017 data. But as a state, we do pretty good that our outages average around 2 hours when you exclude these MEDS events. But with MEDS, our outages can last as much as 8 hours. And then, especially during hurricane. And there were times when at the coast and certain parts of the state that were most devastated from the natural disasters, it can last for days to weeks. But on average, SAIFI, when you exclude the MEDS, it's about 1.25 outages per year. That's better than national average. So when you look at the non-disaster performance or reliability of our grid, it's pretty good. It's when we have the weather-related events that we have, our system is taxed. So as you got a little bit about what reliability is, then you ask your question, well, it's really the resiliency of the grid that we need to focus on. There's a lot going on in this area. The US federal government, FEMA, DOE, the White House, everybody is addressing resiliency in a variety of ways. And just like I mentioned how reliability is measured, there's really not a clear way to quantify resiliency. So a lot of folks have come up with definitions. The Rockefeller Foundation says that resiliency is the capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to survive, adapt, and grow in the face of stress and shocks, and even transform when conditions require it. And the National Academy of Sciences says resiliency is the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, or more successfully adapt to actual or potential adverse events. So in the energy sector, oftentimes resiliency events are shorter in duration. This particular slide was presented by our DOE staff at the last National Governors Association conference on energy. And they basically said that these resiliency events are really what's driving the grid of the future, the planning that must take in modernizing our grid. And in the power sector, resiliency is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. And the cost of these interruptions can be catastrophic. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory produced these estimates that a 16-hour power outage affects a medium to large size company at a rate of about $165,000. For the medium to large size companies, a unit that consumes more than 50,000 annual kilowatt hours of energy. A small commercial or industrial facility cost them about $9,000 just for 2/3 of a day. And a homeowner can cost about $32. And these are just direct costs. It doesn't include the societal costs of these interruptions. In Superstorm Sandy in 2012, you saw a lot of slides yesterday. The overall cost to the industry was over $20 billion. For 2 days, the stock market in New York was shut down, and this resulted in an estimated impact of $7 billion. And one of the examples I like to talk about in New York's Superstorm Sandy resiliency is JP Morgan anticipated that they could be flooded. And so what they did was they piled up sandbags around their huge Manhattan building, several feet high, all around the building. And the storm came and they did get flooded, but their building was fine. So if you see pictures 2 days after Superstorm Sandy, JP Morgan's building is the only one that has lights on. Everyone else has lights off. But their people couldn't get into the building and work. So as a result, they still saw an eruption that cost them lots and lots of money. So they were prepared, or they were more resilient in preparation for that storm. They made their building resilient, but they didn't integrate all of the components that go into the resiliency, which is their employees, their ability to come out of their homes, get into the transportation, and come and do the work. You all have seen the NOAA map. Every year they produce this map, and it's a US map, and they show you all the billion-dollar disasters. And in 2017, we had about 16 separate billion-dollar disasters, totaling over $300 billion. In 2018, we had about 14 separate billion-dollar disasters, costing almost $100 billion. Currently, 15 states have resilience plans, and 5 more are underway, according to Forbes magazine. I'm sure that number is a little more updated. We in North Carolina feel like there is a need for similar resilience planning. And so we are working on a resilience plan development, which is a different topic, and I can go over that another time. But the need for resiliency planning is resonating in the private sector also. Businesses are required now to have a resilience plan in order to show their risk to their investors. I read just this weekend that Moody's ratings agency bought out the one and only company in California that actually analyzes all the data that looks at the risk associated with this changing climate and the weather-related events to different businesses. And the reason they did that was they wanted to understand the cost of these disruptions and the cost to these businesses that eventually they're going to be issuing ratings for. Moody's also is now requiring local governments to have resiliency plans. And just the other day, I heard that the Economic Development Authority is now requiring towns and cities to have resiliency plans. And all of this is due to the data. Here's a chart coming from the NOAA's 2018 or 2019, which is as of July 9th of this year. You can see that the number of billion-dollar events the frequency of that has increased. The top 4 lines are just in the last 4 or 5 years. And that 2019, the red line, is among the top 4 frequency events, number of events that we've seen from January through December. So we don't, unless nothing happens, this line will be along the escalating trends that you're seeing. So with these billion-dollar disasters, let me just say that, I think as a state agency, but as universities, as local planners, we need to secure and be aware of the kind of decisions we need to make today for a better tomorrow. And North Carolina is on the front line, whether we admit it or not. I'm going to walk you through the depressing part. which is the 2018, the number of storms and events that we endured as a state. Beginning of January, we were hit with the winter storm, the first winter storm. And this affected most of our East Coast, not just North Carolina, but all up and down. My mom lives in Baltimore, and she was out of power. This was when we suffered bitter cold temperatures, and it was unusually cold for about a week. And we had snow, and we had ice and sleet, and there were 4 deaths reported. There were over 1,300 crashes in less than 48 hours, and there were 20,000 power outages. Not too long later, 2 weeks later, we had a second winter storm, and there was 12 inches of snow in our area, in the Triad, in the Piedmont area, and there was 1 fatality. At the end of that year, we had the winter storm 3 in December, and here, you all may remember, where more than 20 inches of snow fell in some parts of our state, and there were 2 fatalities reported, and 500,000 homes or so and businesses were lost power. And this is during the winter time. When you're out of power when it's cold, it's not fun. We've experienced it, and it's something you never want to go through again. And then one of the biggest infrastructure that's affected in these kind of storms is our power grid. And when the power's out, almost everything comes down to a standstill. Then in April, there was the tornado in Guilford County that was large enough that it will cause widespread destruction. But most of all, we always talk about the flooding events. In May, it was all up and down the East Coast, but North Carolina was also affected by the subtropical storm Alberto, and it caused extensive western North Carolina flooding. This was when we had 3 weeks of rain across our western North Carolina, some up to 20 inches. And then state disaster was declared in many eligible counties. Florence is probably the most that we talk about, and you think this was the worst of many, but when you go through Matthew and Michael and Florence, it's happened so quickly and so often. But I wanted to go through some of the data, and these are not, I took bits and pieces from our state emergency management slides to sort of tell you a story. In Hurricane Florence, the number of impacted counties was quite large. This map shows you the whole state was affected with the precipitation. There were 22,000 people in 100 or so shelters. And the last shelter closed on November 9th, almost 3 months after the storm hit. We had hundreds of people living in hotels and many living in travel trailers for quite some time. Florence also produced record floods and record rainfall, 35 inches of rain in places. It was called the 1,000-year rain event. There were 50 fatalities, and 34 counties in our state were designated for individual assistance, and 51 counties were designated for public assistance. More than 1,200 roads were closed, and when you have road closure, you can't go out and fix those light poles and those affected power lines that are down. And at the peak of the storm, there was almost more than 750,000 power outages. And there were also some record-breaking events in terms of storm surge. Then, not too long later, we were hit with Hurricane Michael. And here, 4 fatalities were reported. More than 100 were rescued. And this hurricane recovery was almost $1 billion. That's just in our state. Well, more than 82,000 residents called for help, and almost 1 million people were without power. And the federal disaster declaration was requested for over 21 counties. And this is the storm that hit both Florida and North Carolina, and Triad area was affected most. And there's some statistics here that are quite alarming. And Hurricane Matthew was from the year before. So just imagine that the people that have been flooded, who had the least means to move out of the way, they've been affected 2 to 3 times in 2 years. This one was an estimated damage of about $5 billion and 31 fatalities. When more than 4,000 people were in shelters, More than 600 roads were closed. 20 dams were breached, and almost more than three-quarter of a million people were out of power. 2 airports were closed down, and 50 out of the 100 counties were declared disaster area. So, that was our history in 2018, and we're still recovering. I guess that's the word. So as we're recovering, it's hard to imagine resiliency, because we're still trying to put people back in their homes and put the system back before all the disaster occurred. But that's really when the resiliency planning is needed. So when the next storm comes, how are you better prepared and stronger and more resilient to respond to that? And really, there's probably not 100% safety net. You can do your best. For the power grid, the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, says the modern grid is now more complex than ever before. And resiliency is part of that grid, where everything relies on your ability to come back on, because our system is so interconnected. We have, as we learned yesterday, modern electronics, controls, and power systems are now regulating and moving power from one place to the other. And the flexibility needed in terms of fuel supply and the variable generation and the regulatory policies that are put in place to enable our ability to come back online as quick as possible are really going to dictate how resilient we become. One of the things that I like to tell folks is, there is a role that our state government plays in these disaster events that you may not be aware of. Oftentimes when a disaster occurs, the local government is the first, emergency services are first to respond. And when their disaster capability or capacity exceeds, they call the county. And when the county can't reach and supply that need, they call the state emergency management, and they activate what we call the State Emergency Response Team, or CERT. And when that exceeds their capacity, they call, through the governor, federal help. And that's when FEMA and other federal agencies come to assist the state and the local areas. And this is a map of how the CERT process works, and this is codified in our general statute. And I just wanted to let you know that there's a lot of state agencies that are interacting, and our role here in the State Energy Office is right here on the, right there, the State Energy Office. And we create the energy assurance plan, but we're also are out there during these disasters 24 hours a day if needed. Russell Duncan is our representative that literally lives in the building that's where all of this dispatching and all the communication occurs. But the flow diagram just shows you there's a lot going on when a disaster occurs between the utilities and the Department of Commerce and Public Safety and the emergency management folks. And then another quick thing I wanted to show you is there are a lot of what we call the CERT functions, and the operations section, the ESF 12 is where energy is focused. And if this is something that interests you, there's a lot of documents and procedures of how, when a disaster occurs, the energy function is deployed, from getting fuel to the gas stations or fuel to the emergency shelters to getting the power back online. And this is a coordinated effort that goes on between state government and local government and the private sector. And just, there are other ESF functions. There's ESF 1 that's related to transportation, and then ESF 3 is with public works and engineering. So we focus on emergency energy planning because, as we talked about, without energy, it's hard to make our economy go back to where it was. It's part of all hazard planning, and disruptions from one event affects energy, and disruptions from energy affects the other events. So conventional energy relay preparations really are being evaluated in this new light because this is happening so often. And it is taxing the state and local government's ability to respond. There's routine drills and constant evaluation of how we do this. And after every storm, we go back and we retool and revise our methods. And of course, it's all a learning process. David McGowan from the North Carolina Petroleum Council presented how dependent we are in liquid petroleum fuels. 3% of all US consumption comes from our state. So when there is a disruption in just 2 pipelines that provide gasoline and jet fuel and diesel fuel to our state, you can imagine what it could do to the transportation sector. So there's a lot that goes into ensuring not only the pipeline stays functional, but also the terminals that supply the fuel that goes to your to the trucks and then to your gas stations is uninterrupted. In addition to that, there's routine disaster preparation and emergency preparations. These are 2 pictures of the 2018 preparations, one at the Catawba nuclear plant exercise that the EM folks did with Duke Energy, and then the one on the right is the Brunswick nuclear plant exercise. Brunswick is, if you don't know where Brunswick County is, it's on the coast in Hanover, near Hanover County. It joins South Carolina. But this was the area that was flooded the most from Hurricane Florence. And this particular power plant actually was one of the ones that they had to deal with in terms of operational availability. So central generation and transmission and distribution systems are clearly affected by these storms. This is Duke Energy's data from Hurricane Florence. Total between their Duke Energy Carolina and Progress territories, they had more than 1.8 million outages, and they identified more than 27,000 separate incidences. They claim that the Florence response was the largest mobilization in the company's history. And the flooding and wind damages were unprecedented than any other storm that hit Duke Energy. They reported 9 substations that were flooded, and then 92% of their outages were restored within 3 days of the storm passing. And you can see examples of the impact to both their distribution and transmission lines here. This was a picture of their presentation to the Energy Policy Council a couple months ago of the way Duke Energy is making their response and their infrastructure more resilient. And this is a floating substation with an air-filled boat. So utility planning is challenging. Traditional companies, what we call legacy companies, are beginning to reconsider alternative solutions. You can go back and build the way you started, or you can think of it in a different light. Just recently, Con Edison announced that they are going to invest $200 million in what they call non-wires alternatives, instead of putting $1.2 billion in the business as usual, building a substation. Hawaii has a vision for a clean grid, and what they're doing is, for their resiliency, is testing out different new technologies to make their island state more resilient. And they're testing these out while things are good and while they're able to understand their impact and their functionality into the grid. Examples include solar plus storage and renewable grid integration. They passed legislations to support resilience-related microgrid development, and they set a clean energy target by 2045, 100% clean energy. This has also been discussed at the federal level. Now, not only cybersecurity, but the physical response. Just recently, DOE announced more than $100 million in funding designated to prepare the grid for both natural and man-made threats. So the role of distributed energy resources is evolving. We're learning more as these disasters occur. Here's a quote from the Vice President of Strategic Customers and Microgrid Solutions at Schneider Electric. He says that the business model of the utility is being disrupted, and many technologies are now getting attention, like microgrids, and that legacy companies are beginning to seriously consider their implications. A Duke Energy spokesman right after Florence said that solar performed well, but not as well as it wasn't unscathed. However, they did have almost 4 power plants that were down, central power plants. And knowing the importance of these distributed energy resources during these disaster events, there was a guidance document that was released from FEMA for ensuring that the solar installations are as secure and resilient in future storms, and based on the lessons learned between Hurricanes Maria and Irma. And so distributed renewables have the potential to harden the system because they can supply this localized power supply, and they're not as risk because it's towards a shorter distances, and reducing the reliance on the wires. And it's these wires that are really the artery of our central power station that provides the energy. But most of all, as we heard yesterday and all along today, energy efficiency remains the least cost energy resource. And energy efficiency during resiliency planning becomes even more important because the less demand you have, the less you have to generate. And that microgrid that you want that to come on for those hospitals, for those emergency shelters, are not competing for that load that normally wouldn't exist if you didn't have the appropriate energy efficiency measures in place. So this must be a part of an equation not only in energy planning, but also resiliency planning. Here are some examples of microgrid applications that I'm sure you all have seen, both of them by the municipal cooperatives, electric cooperatives, and there's another one in Hot Springs that's going up by Duke Energy. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of experiments going on across the country on the application of microgrids that can island off and supply electricity to much needed infrastructure. We at the state energy offices are trying to use the limited resources and the money that we get from DOE to help the state as much as it can in preparing. Here's an example of a resiliency project study that we did with DOE. It was related to the what we call the Eastern Branch Office Regional Coordination Center in Kinston, North Carolina. Kinston was flooded along with New Bern quite a bit last year. And so this particular response center is a critical infrastructure, we call it. More than 100 personnel are occupying that during what we call a continuity of operations site. And so we wanted to look at building resiliency around this building, and under a DOE grant, contracted engineers to evaluate the emergency power requirements. We looked at not only the infrastructure, but also different ways to supply the power in an emergency situation. We had engineers come out and look at existing load and demand calculations under different weather conditions. And these are the 3 different kinds of options that were analyzed in terms of a 10-year payback using both solar, battery, combined heat and power, demand reductions, and then how the more primary option was selected. Last year, we were, when I first started actually in January in my tenure here as a state energy director, DOE approached us in coming to North Carolina, and they said, we're ahead of the pack in so many things related to buildings, and they asked us to identify about 10 facilities that they could evaluate on a paper study and a technical analysis for creating more resiliency for our energy. And they asked for state and local government buildings that are used for disaster planning and coordination. And so we provided a list of buildings, both on the coast as well as in the Piedmont and the Lumberton, Cumberland County area of North Carolina. And there are, I believe they're still working on coming up with every building by building. They're looking at energy efficiency, energy generation, but the ability to sustain power through on-site generation, but also through distributed energy. So some of that analysis will be available, and we'd like to be able to teach and to disseminate such that other institutions can deploy similar techniques. And then one of the other projects that I wanted to talk about that's just launching with our partners with the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, and also with DOE and NC State. This is a project that was envisioned that's unique, and DOE is also following as to its success. Is based on our few hurricanes that we just talked about, is to conduct a power system analysis and look at the storm's impact under 3 scenarios. And those scenarios are what we call baseline, do nothing, an improved modernized grid, and a more advanced scenario that includes deployment of more DER. And so these 3 scenarios are going to be looked at from an engineering aspect, but also cost and benefit analysis. There will be a stakeholder process that will be put together, and this project is about 2 years long, and we're just getting started. And one of the things we want to do, at least from my perspective, is where are the biggest hazards or risk associated with our power grid? I mean, where is the vulnerability in different parts of our grid? And can those vulnerabilities be reduced through proper planning, through integration of new technologies and existing systems, such that the next time the storm comes and it hits that same area, we're able to get back on as quickly as possible? And the other question is, as Duke Energy and other utilities come in to say, we want to modernize the grid so we're more hardened and more resilient, we need this data, we need this analysis to say, well, is that money being spent at the right places and in the right manner to ensure that the resiliency is, of course, increased? So with that, I wanted to stop, looking for ideas. We're constantly going to look for project funding to support this, the new norm in our state. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
If anybody does have a question, there's a microphone right over there you could approach.
Well, thank you for your time.